Hello everyone! It is time at last to do our Eyre Adaptation comparison of the fire scene. I've been looking forward to talking about this one, and I hope that you have too. It's a very popular scene, but I should warn you, things might get a little silly here. The fire scene takes place in the latter pages of chapter 15 of Charlotte Bronte's book, following the conversation about Adele's mother, which we discussed last time. Between these two scenes, there is an important little bridge, well, I think it's important, that informs us that there have been other conversations that are not recorded. I would have enjoyed hearing more about these conversations, but I guess it's enough just to know that they happened, and that the comfortable companionship between Jane and Rochester continued to develop. During this period of time, Jane's health flourishes, probably because for the first time in her life she's both well-fed and happy. And while she may be falling in love with Rochester, I personally don't think she knows it. At this point, what she acknowledges is a feeling of close kinship. She no longer finds him ugly, but says rather his face is the object she most likes to see. She's not blind to his faults, but rather grieves for their unknown cause. And it's at this point that Charlotte Brontë decides to turn the spark of romance into a flame, to turn up the heat, to kindle the relationship. How many other fire puns can I come up with? The fire scene actually starts out as one of the creepiest scenes in the book, with Jane lying in bed and hearing noises and an evil laugh, and getting up and finding an abandoned candle in the hall, and smoke, and following that smoke to Rochester's room, where she finds him lying in bed surrounded by flames. All the ruckus of Jane putting out the fire causes Rochester to wake, and he makes her sit and wait for him while he goes to check on something. When he returns, he tells her to keep quiet about what's happened and sends her to bed, but then protests that she's leaving him so abruptly. He asks her to shake hands, thanks her for saving his life, and then bids her good night, but doesn't let go of her hand. And that's how this turns into one of the most romantic moments in the story. The prolonged hand-holding, the cherished preserver speech, the strange energy in his voice, strange fire in his look. It's exciting stuff right there. This scene is so important that I'm happy to say all of the adaptations had the good sense to include it. Granted, the 1934 version doesn't do a great job. The scene occurs much later in the story, after the guest's arrival. The flame is so pathetically small, I don't know, can you see it in this picture? And though both Jane and Rochester do a lot of coughing, the smoke is barely visible, although the deteriorated film quality could also be a factor. Jane puts the fire out all by herself and then wakes Rochester, which is good, but Rochester, instead of being surprised or alarmed or acting suspicious, just says, "Why didn't you call for help?" What? So there's no, yeah, Grace Poole did it, but don't tell anybody about this. This is him wrapping the bedspread around her. Not sure if you can tell from the picture. It's just so dark. He tenderly kisses her burnt hands, and then they exchange very quick goodbyes as he's leaving for London tomorrow with his guests. Well, at least they included the scene. As for 1943, maybe I'm in the minority here, but I personally love the fire scene in this version. Maybe it's nostalgia, and maybe it's the black and white cinematography, which I think perfectly captures the gothic atmosphere of the scene. I love the moment when Jane is anxiously waiting for Rochester to come back, and she goes to the window and sees the light moving up the tower. It's a spooky image that's always stuck with me since I was little, to the point that it's been hard for me to remember that it doesn't actually happen in the book, though a couple other versions have imitated it. One thing I'd forgotten about this version of the scene is that Rochester suddenly remembers Adele and rushes off to check on her, which leads to some additional dialogue which originally was part of the third conversation. Rochester tells Jane more about Adele's mother, which prompts him to ask if she'll leave Thornfield now that she knows. I can't believe I completely missed this when I did the third conversation video. This is the problem with analyzing these scenes piecemeal like this. Sometimes dialogue that seems to have been cut has just been moved. In the 1970 version, it's interesting to note that the scene preceding the fire is a brief conversation between Jane and Rochester in which he asks her to take tea with him and cheer him up. It's like a hint of those other unseen conversations. The fire scene itself is very quick, but no less effective. Jane finds Rochester fully dressed and kind of passed out on his bed. It's amazing how quickly someone comes to attention when the room's on fire. I like the way Jane pauses when she goes back out to the hall to pick up the candle, as if she's thinking, hold on, what's this doing here anyway? The scene is about half as long as the others, thanks to some big omissions. Rochester doesn't leave her, and there's no lingering goodnight handshake. He only detains her once, and that's to thank her for saving his life. His persona changes so completely here, his countenance and voice turning so much softer.
I knew you would do me good. I felt it always. There's something about you, Jane.
And then Jane goes back to her room and is all swoony, caressing the spot where his hand gripped her shoulder like, oh my goodness, he touched me! I know I poked fun at this in my original review of this movie 3 years ago, but it is a perfectly understandable reaction, especially when you consider how foreign such physical contact would be to Jane. But it's still funny. And speaking of funny, I think 1973's version of this scene is possibly the most lighthearted overall. Jane is actually sitting up awake, and thinking of Rochester at first, as in the book. When she gets in bed, that's when she hears a crazy laugh in the hall, a laugh that turns into an anguished wail. I think 73 and 96 are the only versions where Rochester sputters, "Is there a flood?" when she dumps water on him. Jason's line reading is particularly funny. This is also the only version with this line.
In the name of all the elves in Christendom, is that Jane Eyre?
This version changes the dialogue at the end of the scene slightly. He says one last good night, and then after she goes, he murmurs,
Jane?
Now, 1983, surprise, surprise, I love this one. It's adorable, from the beginning when Jane almost knocks the candle over onto the carpet, to the end when she leaves his room still wearing his big bearish cloak. Like in 1973, Rochester is fully dressed here. I don't know what exactly he's supposed to be wearing in the book. Jane doesn't really describe that. They still made Zela Clark wear this, which isn't the most flattering outfit, but I think she looks cute in her little cap and dressing gown ensemble. And I love the acting here from both of them. Rochester ranges from annoyed to cautious to domineering to fervent to tender, and Jane's all wide-eyed and hesitant and bewildered, especially when he refuses to let go of her hand and it turns into a little tug-of-war between them. And goodness, just look at how tiny she is compared to him. I love it. By the way, my personal interpretation of this scene is that this is the moment when Rochester realizes he's in love with her.
Oh, my cherished preserver. Good night.
In the 1996 movie, this scene occurs on a very bright night. A close-up shot of a wine glass implies that Rochester drank himself to sleep in bed, which explains why Jane has a particularly difficult time waking him. She yells, she shakes, she tries to drag him out of bed, and as a last resort, she pulls flowers out of a vase and dumps the water over him, to hilarious effect.
Is that a flood?
Those flowers have thorns, so when he goes to shake her hand later, he sees the cuts and presses a handkerchief to them. Aww. I feel like this is the first version that really squeezes them closer together in the handshake moment. The camera position, the framing, the zooming in, it's all designed to make this moment more romantic. As for 1997, this one starts out well. I like the shot of the doorknob turning, as if you-know-who is going down the hall trying every door. Once Jane manages to wake him, Rochester is very active in putting out the fire, pulling nearly all the bedding down to the floor and getting soaked in the process. Meanwhile, Jane just stands there, watching. That makes her look pretty helpless. I prefer it when they work together, or better yet, when Jane puts out the fire by herself before Rochester even wakes up. That's what happens in the book, and it's a great example of Jane's clear-headedness under pressure. What we see next in the 97 adaptation is the side of Ciarán Hinds' Rochester that a lot of people don't like so much.
Come and sit down.
I'm innocent.
What? You want to leave me already after you've just saved my life? Do as you're told and sit down.
She's already freaked out, Rochester. You don't need to make it worse. When Rochester comes back to the room, she immediately starts asking him intrusive questions about Grace Poole and basically accuses him of keeping Grace around as a former lover. Her attitude when saying these ridiculous things, which weren't in the book by the way, makes it painfully obvious that she's jealous, and that's embarrassing. She sounds like a petulant child. I don't know, this whole scene puts me off. Jane acts extremely uncomfortable and almost nauseous, and I can't tell if it's because she's afraid or because she's attracted. It's just too strange. Okay, moving on to the 2006 adaptation, which makes great use of its castle-like setting. The spooky gothic atmosphere is great here, as is the build-up to the moment when Jane opens Rochester's door and sees the burning bed. This dramatic shot makes it look like he's being sacrificed or he's on a funeral pyre. And here we go, we get the first, almost shirtless Rochester, fighting the persistent flames and looking super Byronic at the same time. He covers up a little when he leaves the room, but it's still like, hello, chest! This is definitely one of the sexier ones when it comes to the hand-holding. Just when you think they've gotten as close as they're gonna get, he wraps his dressing gown around her and it's like, whoa! And they just hold on this silhouetted shot for a few seconds. Then Jane goes back to her room and is all Twitter-pated and kissing the hand that he held. Fire? What fire? Lastly, we have the 2011 version, which apparently saw what 2006 did and said, oh yeah? Look what we can do! This scene immediately follows a brief moment in which Jane closely studies a nude painting. Not a whole lot of subtlety about the sexual awakening theme they're pursuing here. I think it's amusing how almost calm Jane and Rochester seem about the fire. Then again, a lot of the reactions in this movie are chill compared to other versions. With regard to accuracy and faithfulness to the book, this script's kind of hit and miss. The biggest surprise is that Rochester says nothing about Grace Poole. But I guess who started the fire isn't really the main concern here. This is the one with Rochester's short, revealing nightshirt. It's also the one where he pulls his pants on in front of Jane. And then there's the hand-holding part, which they managed to build up to epic proportions, where the distance between them slowly shrinks until they're so close. It's insane! This almost kiss moment is very hot and exciting and all that, but you know, it doesn't exactly scream Jane Eyre to me. Honestly, for me, less is more. You don't need to go over the top for me to get it. But hey, some people love this moment just the way it is and probably think that what I just said about it sounds crazy. That's okay. That's what's wonderful about having all these different versions. There are different interpretations to appeal to different tastes. For me, at least at this moment, I think the 1983 version of the scene is my favorite. It gave me all the warm fuzzies I wanted, while also being true to the story and entertaining as well. Go ahead and share your own thoughts on this scene down below. I'm always curious to hear what you have to say, and what your favorite version of it is if you have one. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching!